So, does the Omelas argument for antinatalism stretch the concept of responsibility too far? This presentation, given originally in the University of Helsinki's von Wright and Wittgenstein seminar, is based on one argument introduced in the book Anti-natalism, Extinction and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption by Amanda Sukenick and me, Matti Häyry. Here is Amanda telling in 3 minutes what the book is about.
Anti-natalism is a philosophy and social movement assigning a negative value to reproduction. People should not have children. Other sentient beings should not have offspring. Machine sentience should not be developed. In the best possible world, the cycle of suffering is broken. Many find the idea mistaken and unthinkable. Why suggest something like this when humankind has struggled for survival for so long? Why propose extinction when technology could eliminate suffering? And what could be wrong with passing on the gift of life? In this element, we answer these questions. The ancient Greeks, influenced by other cultures, realized that human life has no purpose. Why continue it then? Plato responded by creating a belief-defying metaphysical system. The world was created by an artisan god who had to work with imperfect materials. Human efforts are needed to complete the work. Early Christian sects relaunched the anti-natalist challenge. Augustine of Hippo countered them by proposing that our earthly life is followed by a purpose-giving afterlife, if only we take our suffering in good stride. The challenges and responses have continued to this day. Western philosophy can, in fact, be seen as an endless struggle against anti-natalism. If reproduction stops, species, including humans, will go extinct. If our aim is to eliminate suffering, this is a good development. If our aim is to perpetuate life, not so good. Consistent anti-natalism must come to terms with the fact that its consequence is the demise of species. At least for humans, this could be accomplished voluntarily. For some time, the possibility of human extinction was seen to count against anti-natalism. Surely our species must survive. We question this premise. Opponents of anti-natalism believe that reproduction itself gives meaning to our existence. Having children and raising them up to have more children gives purpose to human life. We argue that while this is true, it is also the strongest argument against reproduction. It places parents in the horns of a procreative dilemma. If generations continue to follow one another, sooner or later someone in their line will have a truly miserable life. Parents raising their children to have more children will be guilty of creating that misery. They can avoid this by teaching their children not to have children of their own, but by doing so, they deny their offspring the purpose in life that they themselves achieved by reproducing. Either way, procreators are doomed to morally corrupt themselves.
Antinatalism is a phenomenon not many people know about, but it's breaking into mainstream media step by step. Helsingin Sanomat Helsinki News distribution 500,000 ran a feature of me, slightly unfortunately with the title Human Race End Already, with an exclamation mark. I don't mind the human race ending, but I do mind the imperative implied by the exclamation mark. Let me explain. This is what I told the journalist, first thing in the interview. I am an anti-natalist philosopher. Being an anti-natalist philosopher means to me that I don't have children. I don't intend to have children. And I would be content if everyone acted like me in this respect. Content, I said, not over the moon, not telling people what to do, just accepting the consequences even if no one had children anymore. As it was, readers saw me telling them what to do and returned the usual responses. In the newspaper's comment section, why don't you kill yourself? In a nationalist news outlet, cultural Marxism is rampant in Helsinki News. And in Twitter X, of course, with a face like that, the original decision must have been involuntary. In other words, nothing new under the sun. In 1984, I and my then partner completed our master's thesis defending abortion and euthanasia. 2 years later, we had managed to publish them as a book, and its publicity created a small to medium-sized media frenzy for a while. In the Helsinki News, a letter to the editor posited that following our logic, the entire human race could be eradicated, the title of the letter. Which is kind of funny, because I woke up to the idea of extinction only more than a decade later. I was in an academic meeting in Cowbridge, Wales, with my then partner, different from the previous one, and one night in November 1998 we discussed the plight of the world. What can be done to end all this suffering? Button, we decided, in an exchange that we have ever since referred to as the Cowbridge Diaries. And the family photo album has a picture of me sitting on what the caption calls the button bed. By which we meant, of course, the thought experiment. You can end all suffering in the world by pressing the big red button that instantaneously removes all sentient life. Do you press it? You can find out my answer in our conversation with Amanda in the Exploring Anti-natalism podcast episode 65 at about 22 minutes. But the real beef was yet to come. We had moved to the northwest of England, and then in 2004 I published this. A rational cure for pre-reproductive stress syndrome. I had just learned about the importance of citations and decided to create a citation bait to boost my own. Half-jokingly I presented the desire to have children as a medical condition, pre-reproductive stress syndrome, and suggested that it could be cured by simple cognitive therapy by telling people that having children is irrational and immoral. Or, as I put it in the shortest of abstracts ever.
Since human reproduction is arguably both irrational and immoral, those who seek help before conceiving could be advised it is all right not to have children.
I offered the paper to the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the biggest medical journals, and received a prompt rejection. We thank you for your contribution, but it's not really in our domain. Luckily I had friends in the Journal of Medical Ethics, and there it went. In the paper, which is now known as the original source for the risk argument for antinatalism, I actually presented two such arguments, and caused much confusion, not least to myself. The first was based on maximin rationality. You know, the John Rawls idea that decisions should be for the best of those who are worst off. This is how I formulated my case.
When people consider the possibility of having children, they confront the following choice. They can decide not to have children, in which case nobody will be harmed or benefited. The value of this choice, in terms of the potential future individuals and their lives, is zero. Alternatively, they can decide to have children, in which case the new individual can be born. If this happens, the life of the future individual can be good or bad. The eventual value of the decision, depending on the luck of the reproducers, can be positive, zero, or negative. Since it is rational to avoid the possible negative outcome when the alternative is zero, it is rational to choose not to have children.
And because I love drawing pictures of everything, here is the same in visual form. The choice then is to have a child or not to have a child. Not having a child leads to no life, the value of which is zero. Having a child can lead to the emergence of a relatively good life, the value of which can be seen as positive. But it can also lead to the creation of a very bad life, and the value then is negative. According to the maximin rule, I argued, avoiding the worst possible outcome, the bringing into existence a life of negative value, suggests that the child should not be had. To which my many critics then and now have responded that since extremely few lives are horribly bad, this is irrational timidity. Perhaps in anticipation of this critique, I also launched another argument in the paper, this one based on negative utilitarian morality. Looking back, I presented it unclearly, or at least in too many words. And since we don't have to repeat that mistake, here is the message stripped of all the confusing extras.
I believe it is morally wrong to cause avoidable suffering to other people. Since all human beings suffer at some point in their lives, every parent who could have declined to procreate is to blame.
And to the drawing board. The preliminaries are the same as in the maximin case. We can have a child or not to have a child, resulting in no life or a relatively good life or a very bad life. No life implies no suffering, a relatively good life some suffering, and a very bad life much suffering. According to negative utilitarianism, we should not contribute to creating suffering, so we shouldn't have the child. To which my critics have responded that while much suffering should probably be avoided, some suffering is inevitable in human lives, so stop whining about it and get on with your life. Anti-natalists saying this, that and the other to mitigate the objection, but in the majority of human minds it stands. And this brings us to the topic of this presentation, the Omelas argument introduced by Amanda and me in the book. The risk argument for anti-natalism number 3, the Omelas child. And once you have heard the argument, quite possibly the darkest there is against having children, you will wonder what these two nincompoops are grinning about. So let's take this step by step and first reiterate why there is a need for another argument. And here we go. As a background factor, extant justifications for antinatalism, those that don't involve the concept of risk, do not convince people. The main one is an appeal to the poor quality of human or sentient existence. All lives are miserable, so let's not create any. Well, Amanda and I agree with this, and so do all other 17 hardcore antinatalists. But ask a person in the street, ask you for that matter, and the likeliest answer is, I'm fine, thank you, don't worry about me, and so will my children be, so don't worry about them either, we'll manage. The other main argument for antinatalism is from the obvious lack of consent. They cannot give their permission to be born, so who are we to force them to exist? To which any philosopher will answer, they cannot give their permission not to be born either, so who are we to deny them existence? Not a road to be traversed all that easily. The remaining main argument for antinatalism is an appeal to the risk involved in reproduction. As we have seen, however, previous attempts do not seem to have convinced people. Maximin. Well, a truly awful life is too improbable to count, it seems. And negative utilitarianism. Fails, opponents say, because there is no life without suffering. But let's stop there for a while. There is no life without suffering, from which pronatalists or natalists or reproducers or whatever they choose to call themselves deduce that it's all right to create new, painful, anguished lives. A different conclusion could of course be drawn, as did Arthur Schopenhauer, who in his The Blessed Calm of Non-Existence in 1851 opined,
If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not a man rather have so much sympathy for the coming generation as to spare it the burden of existence, or at any rate not take it upon himself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood?
Accompanied later by animal rights activist and anarchist Marie Huot, who in The Pain of Living 1892 lamented the human insistence on living despite knowing that life basically sucks, is evil.
Still, if man only accepted this burden for himself, he could be forgiven. But he cowardly obeys his instinct and perpetuates the cursed heritage by giving life to beings who did not ask to be born. More often than not, he commits this homicide unconsciously, but when he premeditates the crime, no punishment is severe enough to make him atone for it.
There are contemporary anti-natalists like Kari Makerma and Lawrence Anton who keep digging for these historical gems and feeding the hungry anti-natalist community with them. Brilliant work, meaningful for pessimists, anarchists and other dissenters, only dismissed by the more life and order hugging moral majority. And so, on we go to our argument. It is based on Ursula K. Le Guin's 1973 science fiction short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And this is how the story goes. Omelas is a utopian town where everybody is happy. There is no injustice, there is only eternal bliss. Except that to uphold the serenity and bliss, the townspeople have to keep one child in perpetual filth, darkness and misery. When the citizens are old enough to know the truth, the child is made known, shown to them. After the initial shock, most of them accept the situation, but some, as signaled in the title of the story, walk away. And to translate this into our video abstract language, by having children, reproducers open up the route to the creation of an individual with a miserable life sometime in the future. This individual, so to speak, is the Omelas child. And the reproducers, all reproducers, are its creators and responsible for it. To repeat the message step by step, this is what we are saying to people who consider having progeny. Your children may be happy. Their children may also be happy. But in time someone in a reproductive line will be unhappy. The line you start is no exception to this. By starting a line you create an Omelas child. That child will then pay for everybody else's bliss. To which, if you are anything like the standard reproducer that we have encountered, you will say, but it's not my fault, is it? It may never happen, you say. It's so far away, you say. I only meant well, you say. It's important to me, you say. And then, if you are a philosopher or theologian, you can add a few other things. Sacrifices are noble. Collateral damage always occurs. It's still a life. And life has meaning. Let's take a closer look at these one by one. It may never happen, by which we can mean at least two things. Parents can tell their children not to reproduce, and the line will be broken while it's still more or less controllable. In theory they can, but will they? Parents telling their children not to have children are essentially saying that they have made a mistake and that it would be better if their children would never have come to exist. Not a very good topic for a family conversation. And besides, are they even allowed to do so? They would be denying their children the whatever benefits that they have themselves gained by reproducing. And that has a distinctly egoistic ring to it. In the really optimistic scenario, of course, parents can hope, maybe even believe, that their child will invent a cure for cancer or in other ways remove future suffering. Their child might indeed invent a cure for cancer, but is the probability high enough to justify the choice? And there is more suffering in the world than that. The one child will not remove it all. I only meant well. One side of this objection concerns parental expectations and their fulfillment. My family, community, society, friends and peers wanted me to have the child, so I had it. To which the proper response might be,
Congratulations! On the orders of others, you have now created one more producer, consumer, and soldier to serve the capitalist, consumerist system, and to act as cannon fodder for the military-industrial complex.
For some, of course, this would be a proper compliment. Be that as it may, I only meant well can also be future individual related. I didn't intend to create a miserable life. That came about, if it did come about, as an undesired and unintended side effect. The neo-Thomistic Roman Catholic doctrine of double effect gives one formulation of this. When you are trying to do good, you can allow some bad second effects if you don't know for sure that they will occur. Interpretations vary, but I would like to think that this road has been closed by the Omelas argument. There will be an individual with a miserable life in the future, and we cannot unintend that by holding our breath or putting our head in the sand. It's so far away. The point here is that for merely possible future harm we must use a discount rate, give more weight to the almost sure happiness of our children and the quite probable happiness of their children, than to the uncertain unhappiness of some distant people. Well, apart from removing or at least seriously distancing future generations from moral considerations, this objection does not, I think, apply to the Omelas type scenario. Someone will suffer. It's a certainty, not a possibility. Hence no discount rate is needed. I may be wrong here. Let me let you in on a secret at this point. All the 8 pro-natalist points presented in this mega slide and all my responses to them are explications of the main question Amanda and I pose in this presentation. Does the Omelas argument for anti-natalism stretch the concept of responsibility too far? In this particular case, I am at the same time certain and uncertain about our own claim. Can we say that the eventual existence of the Omelas child is an inevitable fact? After all, anything can happen. Maybe against all odds, the parents will bring their children up as anti-natalists. Maybe all suffering will miraculously be removed before the bad card is turned. Maybe a meteorite will wipe out all life. Who knows? My interpretation, our interpretation here is that the certainty is in the opening the door for the possibility. Is that enough? Opinions are, I suppose, bound to vary. Anyway, moving on. We have many more objections to sieve through here. The eventual emergence of the miserable life will not touch any of us, so why care? I don't know how that sounds to you. It's true, of course, but does it have a never mind the future generations ring? And that's not really on, is it? It's important to me is gaining ground as one of the most popular excuses for reproducing. Children give my life meaning, the line usually goes. And that, of course, is fine and well, seeking meaning for your life, except perhaps not so much at the expense of future individuals. Does your meaning-seeking justify the creation of an Omelas child? Or, to put this in other words, does reproductive self-interest really trump everything else? Maybe it does. Not for me, but oh well. That concluded the set of more parent-oriented objections to our argument. The other set concentrates on the lot of the child, the first one being that sacrifices are noble. This is a line of argument that actually travels from other galaxies, the most notable being the galaxy of Star Trek, the TV and movie saga. In the pivotal scene, the science officer of Starship Enterprise, Mr. Spock, is dying in isolation because, if let out, he could contaminate the rest of the crew with a deathly virus. He decides to sacrifice himself and has a mimic exchange with his superior and friend Captain Kirk. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. Fine cinematic moment, fine utilitarian confession of faith, but the Omelas child we are talking about is not Mr. Spock, not an existing voluntary self-sacrifice maker, but an involuntary object of other people's decision-making. Changing tack reproducers can argue that whatever appeal Ursula K. Le Guin's fiction may have, in real life even the worst life is still a life. I have done some work on this argument over the years, and it seems to me that it's based on a specific and possibly mistaken idea of the value of human life. People who root for reproduction, pro-natalists, tend to think that the value of life ranges from very good, full positive, to close to zero. Most lives, however, are very good or at least quite good, and the lower end is an exception, maybe the case when rare individuals claim to have truly horrible wrongful lives and sue their parents for being alive. Anti-natalists more naturally believe that human life is nothing much to write home about. The most famous anti-natalist philosopher of our time, David Benatar, is on record saying that even the best lives are very bad. And of course worse lives are even worse, approaching full negative value, however that is defined. I am myself on record as a hedonistic pessimist, thinking that the value of my life as a whole remains below zero, although not always as much as Benatar claims. Our self-evaluations, however, are beside the point here. And the point is that when the full range from negative to positive is recognized, it is easier to understand that the Omelas child's life quality can be unequivocally bad, irredeemable by the insistence that it's still alive. It is still alive, but that speaks against rather than for allowing its existence. An appeal to the realities of life pops up next. Collateral damage occurs, meaning that everything we do has consequences. Count far enough into the future and someone is harmed by any action or inaction we take. Life would be impossible without it. Now this is obviously true, but possibly irrelevant in our context. I'll return to this after the last objection box of this slide, which is that life has meaning. Since this is another main theme of antinatalism, extinction and the end of procreative self-corruption, I'm not dwelling in it here. It's the topic of another presentation. But instead, I refer to Ursula K. Le Guin to make a quick point. She writes,
They all know it is there, all the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it. Others are content merely to know it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why and some do not, but they all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest, and the kindly weathers of their skies, depend wholly on this child's abominable misery.
Which leads me at least to ask, to whom does the life have meaning? Not to the child, surely. If to the parents, is this relevant? But as I said, this is a whole other can of worms, and I will not open the lid anymore. But I promised some more reflection on the collateral damage or everything has consequences point, so here goes. We live in this world with billions of other people. Many of them are in dire need, but we cannot respond to every need in the world. We don't have the resources. We cannot be, in an action-prompting sense, morally responsible. If we were, we would have to accept a ridiculously strict view of our liability, expressed in its extreme form by Fyodor Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov. Father Zosima states,
There is only one way to salvation, and that is to make yourself responsible for all men's sins. As soon as you make yourself responsible in all sincerity for everything and everyone, you will see at once that this is really so, and that you are in fact to blame for everyone and for all things.
This quote is standardly used to indicate that if you are responsible for everything, then you are not really responsible for anything. You just have to accept your guilt and throw yourself at the mercy of God. Against that view, more realistic for want of a better word, commentators say that there has to be a limit to our responsibility. The extent of that limit is a matter of dispute, but tentatively we can agree that our happy parents in the top middle are probably not responsible for all the need, frustration and misery of all the other billions of people that they share the planet with. But even so, they are responsible for the need, frustration and misery of the individuals they produce or conspire to produce into this world. The Omelas child is not collateral damage of their living their lives. It is the direct or indirect result of their moral choices. So our question here was, does the Omelas argument for anti-natalism stretch the concept of responsibility too far? I say no, not necessarily. And the jovial nincompoops say no, not necessarily. And they invite you to read the book for further arguments if you are still in doubt. We welcome all comments, critical and otherwise, with thanks. Thank you.